The chapel stood at the edge of the town like a crown of stone, its white walls glowing faintly under the pale sun. To anyone walking past, it was a symbol of faith and peace, a place where people gathered to kneel, whisper prayers, and find comfort. Children played in its shadow after school, their laughter bouncing against the old bricks. The bells, when they rang, had a way of cutting through silence in a way that felt both grounding and haunting. But beneath the soil that held its foundation, hidden from the eyes of the faithful, lay something that would one day unearth more questions than answers. The bones of people who had never been given a name on a gravestone. The town itself had always been small and tight-knit, the kind of place where strangers were noticed, where the gossip of one day became the truth of the next. Families had lived there for generations, inheriting both the land and the secrets buried in it. Life moved at a steady rhythm. Markets in the square, festivals in the summer, funerals followed by meals shared between neighbors. Nothing about it seemed extraordinary, at least on the surface. The chapel, though, carried a presence that weighed on those who passed by. Built over a century ago, it rose from the earth on the ruins of something older, something that few wanted to talk about. Its doors were carved with biblical scenes, its altar heavy with gold that had been donated by wealthy families seeking to buy not just salvation, but status. People came to it with trust in their hearts, believing it to be a holy place, never questioning what had been erased to make way for its beauty. Among the families who gathered there, some stood out more than others. There were the powerful, the ones who sat in the front pews, whose donations kept the candles burning and the roof repaired. Their names were carved into plaques on the walls, their influence WHI, spoke about in the streets. Then some lingered in the back, quiet, humble, grateful to even be there at all. These divisions were rarely spoken of, but they were always felt. The air inside the chapel was never equal. It was divided by wealth, by reputation, by who held control and who simply obeyed. The people tied to what was to come were not unlike everyone else in town. At first glance, they seemed ordinary, even kind. They smiled at neighbors, bowed their heads in prayer, and lived lives that seemed steady, if not simple. One had a way of commanding attention, their voice smooth and convincing, their confidence drawing others close. Another carried themselves with quiet strength, though there was always a shadow behind their eyes, as if something weighed heavily on them that they could not share. And there were others still, friends, family, neighbors, who carried secrets they didn't yet know would soon matter. What made their stories unsettling was not what they did in the light of day, but what stirred in the dark corners of their homes and hearts. Power, once it seeps into a person, rarely lets go. For some, it was the need to be admired, to be seen as a guide in a place where faith held power. For others, it was the quiet resentment of being overlooked, the sting of knowing they would never sit in the front pew, no matter how much they prayed. These small resentments and hungers, carried silently, had a way of shaping what was to come. The chapel itself became more than a place of worship. It was a stage, a mirror of the town's hidden struggles. Behind its polished wood and shining chalices, there were whispers of things not meant to be spoken. Its foundations were not as clean as the sermon suggested. People felt it, though most ignored it. The land seemed unsettled, the ground colder in some spots than others, as if the earth was keeping something locked away. For those who gathered there, life before the crime seemed normal enough. Children went to school, parents worked the fields or kept shops, and Sundays were for God. But under the surface, the cracks were already spreading. Relationships that looked steady from the outside were full of strain. Behind closed doors, words were sharper, silences heavier. Some smiled through gritted teeth. Others carried bruises hidden under sleeves, and still others drowned their fears in drink or silence. The power of appearances was strong here. The need to look perfect in public often masked the rotting truth at home. And those who wanted control over people, over stories, over the memory of the town itself, were already weaving their strings, pulling people closer, tying them into knots they could not easily escape. In the years leading up to the crime, no one spoke about the ground under the chapel. To them, it was just earth, nothing more. Yet there were hints, small signs left like warnings. Old men remembered stories of fields where bodies had been tossed like waste. Women recalled the way the soil sank in certain places after heavy rain, as though something below was shifting. Children swore they heard voices when they pressed their ears to the chapel floor, faint whispers they couldn't quite understand. Most laughed these things off, calling them imagination, old tales, or foolish talk. But not everyone dismissed them. Some carried the knowledge like a stone in their chest, heavy and impossible to forget. When the crime came, it didn't just reveal what one person had done. It unearthed everything that had been hidden, both in the ground and in the hearts of those who thought they had left the past buried. The chapel, once a place of safety, would soon become the setting of suspicion, fear, and truths that no one was ready to face. The town, with all its quiet streets and warm Lee. GHTS was not as safe as it seemed. The people, with all their prayers and polite smiles, were not as pure as they wished to believe. And the ground, holding the weight of both the chapel and its secrets, was never silent. It had been waiting, patient and merciless, for the day it would all come undone. The chapel bells rang with a hollow echo that seemed heavier than before, as if even their sound was tired of carrying the weight of the town's secrets. Life continued, at least in appearances, prayers whispered at dawn, candles lit in trembling hands, hymns sung with eyes closed tight. But beneath it all, tension thickened. It was in the way neighbors looked too long at one another, in the way conversations faltered mid-sentence, in the way silence followed after certain names were spoken. Something unseen was rising, crawling into the lives of those who had thought themselves safe. At the center of it all was the man who stood at the front of the chapel. His voice carried easily, filling the pews, convincing, soothing, and yet sharp enough to cut through anyone who dared question him. People trusted him, some even adored him, but others kept their unease tucked away, their doubts whispered only at kitchen tables after dark. His authority wasn't only spiritual, it bled into every part of the town. He had a hand in decisions that weren't his to make. His influence spread wide, and though some resented it, they rarely challenged him. Behind his calm smile, there was an obsession with control. Every glance that wasn't full of respect pricked him like a thorn. Every sign of defiance gnawed at him in ways he never let show. But not everyone bowed so easily. Some carried themselves differently, who resisted his grip in subtle, quiet ways. One of them had always drawn attention without meaning to, a figure whose presence unsettled the balance he tried to maintain. They spoke less but meant more. Their strength was quiet, but it was enough to plant doubt in those who were tired of following without question. He saw this as a threat, even if no one else named it as such. And in private moments, his calm mask cracked, revealing bitterness, jealousy, and a hunger to break down what he could not bend. These clashes were rarely open fights. They were disguised as polite exchanges, veiled criticisms, long stares across candlelit pews. Yet each one carved deeper into the fragile peace of the town. What started as small slights grew into silent wars, fueled by pride and wounded egos. Others began to notice, even if they didn't speak of it. They felt the weight in the air when the two crossed paths, saw the flicker of resentment in their eyes. The chapel that had once been a place of unity was now divided by invisible lines, loyalty split, trust thinning. Outside tea. Each chapel walls, life was no kinder. The town had been struggling. Crops had failed in recent seasons. Debts piled up, and the distance between the wealthy and the poor stretched wider each day. Families who once managed to live modestly now found themselves begging for help, and those in power used this desperation to tighten their hold. A bag of flour or a few coins given in charity became leverage, a way to secure obedience. People who wanted freedom were trapped by needs too basic to ignore. Every meal, every roof, every piece of clothing became a reminder of who controlled their fate. This pressure seeped into homes, poisoning relationships. Parents snapped at children, husbands lashed out at wives, and wives carried bruises in silence. The stress of survival bred anger, and anger bred blame. People turned on one another when they should have come together. And in the shadows of these strained homes, secrets grew. Affairs hidden under the cover of night, debts owed to the wrong people, stolen goods exchanged in whispers, all of it adding to the quiet storm building over the town. For some, the chapel became a refuge from this chaos, but for others, it became a prison. Behind its stone walls, decisions were made that reached into every life. The man at the altar thrived on this, using confession as both weapon and shield. People spilled their sins to him in the dark, trusting him to keep their secrets, but he remembered every word, storing them like tools to use when needed. Those who crossed him often found their own sins suddenly known by others, spread in subtle ways that destroyed reputations and left them isolated. One woman knew this power all too well. She had confessed things she wished she hadn't, desperate for forgiveness, only to feel those sins weaponized against her later. At first, she thought she was imagining it. The quiet remarks, the looks from neighbors. But soon it was clear that her private words had not stayed private. Humiliated and angry, she carried her shame quietly, but inside her grew a cold fury. She was not the only one. Others, too, realized they were being used, manipulated, trapped by the very place they thought would save them. Beneath all this, the past continued to haunt the land. Whispers about the ground under the chapel returned, especially from the older generation who remembered more than they admitted. They spoke of people who vanished decades ago, people who were poor, unwanted, or inconvenient. They never returned, and no one looked too hard for them. The land beneath the chapel was said to be restless because of it, cursed, unable to hold the weight of silence any longer. The younger ones laughed at these stories, but the old knew better. They had seen too much. The breaking point drew closer with every passing week. Small incidents piled up like dry wood, waiting for the spark. A heated argument in the square that ended in threats spoken too loudly. A drunken night that revealed secrets not meant to be heard. A letter discovered in the wrong hands, showing betrayal deeper than anyone expected. And always, behind it all, the figure at the altar, pulling strings, tightening his control, watching as the cracks widened. What made it worse was the hypocrisy. Those who demanded purity and obedience were the same who lived double lives. Their words preached one thing, but their actions betrayed them. Some indulged in affairs, some in greed, some in cruelty that left scars on those closest to them. The town saw glimpses of this, enough to stir Ange, but not enough to confront it outright. Fear still held them back, fear of losing what little they had, fear of what might happen if they spoke too loudly. The people most tangled in this web began to unravel. The man at the altar grew sharper, his patience thinning, his need for control growing darker. The one who resisted him felt the weight of standing against someone so powerful, their resolve hardening even as doubt gnawed at them. The woman whose secrets had been used against her became colder, her anger sharpening into something dangerous. And others, drawn in by circumstance, by loyalty, or by desperation, found themselves caught between sides they never asked to choose. The town itself seemed to shift with these tensions. Nights grew quieter, as though people feared being seen after dark. The chapel bells rang less sweetly, their sound hollow, almost mocking. Even the air felt heavy, as though the earth itself was bracing for what was about to happen. No one could have predicted exactly how the crime would unfold, but in truth, it had been building for years. It was not born from a single act of violence, but from every whispered secret, every abuse of power, every silent bruise carried behind closed doors. It was the weight of history pressing down, the bones beneath the chapel reminding the living that nothing stays buried forever. The people involved were not monsters from the start. They were human, flawed, desperate, proud, and afraid. But as the days grew darker, those flaws sharpened into something more dangerous. They became driven by jealousy, by betrayal, by the hunger for power or the thirst for revenge. And as each of them stepped further into the shadows of their own making, the path back into the light disappeared. The crime was no longer a question of if, but when. The town could feel it. They carried it in their restless sleep, in their uneasy glances, in the silence that fell whenever certain names were spoken. The chapel, with its shining walls and holy songs, stood taller than ever, but its foundation was cracking. And soon, the truth buried beneath it would demand to be heard. The night of the crime was marked by a storm that seemed to arrive out of nowhere. Clouds rolled in thick and low, pressing down on the town until the air felt hard to breathe. The chapel bells had rung earlier that evening, their hollow notes carried by the wind, but now the storm drowned out every other sound. Rain pelted the roof, slid down the stained glass windows in streaks that distorted the holy images, and lightning split across the sky with a violence that made the earth tremble. Inside, candles burned unsteadily, their flames flickering like frightened hearts. The people most bound to this story had all found themselves in the chapel that night. Some came because they had been called, others because they were desperate, irate, and one because they had been waiting for this moment all along. The air between them was heavy with words that had not been spoken, with secrets that clawed for release. Each step, each glance, each shallow breath felt like it was moving them closer to something none of them could turn away from. The man at the altar carried himself as if the storm belonged to him, as if even the thunder answered to his voice. His confidence had not wavered, but inside, fear gnawed at him. Fear of losing control, fear of being exposed. He knew too much was slipping away. People had started to question him, to resist him, and that was something he could not allow. His words that night were sharp, biting, meant to wound. They were not sermons. They were threats dressed in scripture. The one who had resisted him the longest stood at the back, fists clenched at their sides, heart pounding so hard it shook through their chest. They had carried the weight of opposition for too long, and tonight it burned through them like fire. Every insult, every manipulation, every cruel twist of power had brought them here. They could no longer stay silent. Their voice cut through the storm, firm and steady, challenging the man at the altar in front of everyone present. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Gasps echoed through the chapel, whispers rising like smoke. The man at the altar stiffened, his eyes flashing with rage that no longer bothered to hide behind kindness. His voice thundered back, not with holy words, but with venom, accusations that stripped away the veneer of holiness. He spoke of sins that were meant to be buried, secrets entrusted to him in confession, dragging them into the open as weapons. Faces in the pews paled as their private shames were spilled into the air. The confrontation spiraled quickly, words turning into shouts, shouts into threats. Lightning flashed through the stained glass, painting the chapel in brief washes of blood red and gold. The storm outside raged in sync with the storm inside. Each person in that room felt the pull of it, their own fears and anger feeding into the chaos. The breaking point came suddenly, almost too fast to catch. A movement, someone lunging forward, hands shaking with fury and desperation. A struggle broke out at the foot of the altar, candles tipping, wax spilling across the floor. The sound of bodies colliding echoed louder than the thunder outside. There was a cry, part rage, part anguish, and then the sharp, sickening crack of something breaking. Silence followed for one suspended moment, the kind of silence that makes the air feel hollow. Then came the realization. Blood spread quickly across the polished floor, dark against the pale stone. It seeped into the cracks, winding its way toward the very foundation of the chapel, as if the ground itself had been waiting for it. The man at the altar lay crumpled, his body twisted, his eyes wide with shock that was quickly fading into emptiness. The one who had struck the blow froze, staring at their hands as if they no longer recognized them. Rage had carried them, but now it drained out, leaving only horror. Their breath came in shallow gasps, their chest heaving as their mind scrambled to process what had just been done. They hadn't planned this, not truly, and yet it had been waiting for years, building with every injustice, every wound, every moment of silence forced upon them. Around them, the others erupted into panic. Some screamed, the sound echoing off the chapel walls in a way that made it almost inhuman. Others stumbled backward, clutching at rosaries, whispering frantic prayers that their lips could barely form. A few moved forward, trying to help, but their hands hovered helplessly over the body, unsure if there was even anything left to save. The storm outside battered the walls as if it, too, wanted inside. The one who caused it all fell to their knees, hands trembling, whispering words no one could hear over the chaos. They didn't look triumphant. They didn't even look free. They looked shattered, a person undone by the weight of what they had carried for too long. Regret flashed across their face, but so did something else. Relief, twisted and fragile. The chains of fear had been broken, but at a cost no one could ever undo. Some tried to take control of the situation, voices rising above the panic, urging calm, demanding silence. But fear had already taken root. No one trusted anyone anymore. Whispers of blame began almost immediately. Accusations flying, hands pointing, stories already twisting in the minds of those who needed to protect themselves. The crime was not just a single act of violence. It was the spark that set the entire town ablaze. In the chaos, someone suggested covering it up. To bury it, to let the chapel swallow it the way it had swallowed so many others before. It would be easy, they argued. The storm would wash away the traces outside, the ground beneath already eager to take more. Others resisted, horrified at the thought of repeating the sins that had cursed the land. The argument fractured them further, each side desperate, each voice shaking. The body at the altar seemed almost to mock them. Once, he had been the one in control, his word unshakable, his power absolute. Now he was nothing but silence and blood, a broken reminder of how quickly power can vanish. And yet, even in death, he still held control. His absence would leave a vacuum, one that others would scramble to fill. Already, some in the room were calculating, their grief mingled with self-preservation. The storm outside reached its peak, lightning flashing so bright it illuminated the chapel like daylight for an instant. In that light, their faces were revealed. Fearful, furious, guilty, broken. They were bound together now, not by faith, not by community, but by a crime that none of them could escape. The chapel had become something different that night. No longer a sanctuary, no longer a place of prayer, but a crime scene. The walls that once echoed with hymns now held the memory of screams. The altar, once polished with devotion, was stained with blood, and the ground beneath, already heavy with unma. Ricked graves had received yet another offering as the storm began to fade, leaving only the steady drip of rain. The people inside knew there was no turning back. Their lives had been split in two, the time before this night and the time after. Nothing would be the same again. The crime had not just killed a man. It had torn open the heart of the town, exposing everything it had tried so hard to bury. The storm had passed by morning, but the town did not breathe easier. The chapel, once a beacon at its center, loomed heavy in the daylight, its white walls now shadowed by what had taken place inside. Word of the crime spread faster than anyone could contain it. By dawn, whispers had turned into rumors, and by midday, rumors had hardened into something like truth, though each version of the story was twisted differently depending on who told it. What remained constant, however, was the shock. The man who had once held the town in his grip was dead, and his blood still stained the altar floor. For those who had been there that night, silence became both a shield and a torment. Some denied what they had seen, convincing themselves that it had been an accident, a tragedy no one had intended. Others justified it, whispering that perhaps he had deserved it, that the years of manipulation, the cruelty disguised as devotion, had finally caught up with him. But even those who tried to reason with themselves could not escape the guilt that clung to them like smoke. They had been there. They had seen. And whether they had acted or stood frozen, their lives were now tied to that moment forever. The one who had delivered the fatal blow carried the heaviest burden. In the hours after, they wandered through their thoughts like a haunted house, each corner holding another face, another memory, another regret. At times, they shook with horror, unable to believe what their hands had done. At other times, they felt an odd calm, as though some unbearable weight had finally been lifted. Yet the relief only deepened their shame, because how could freedom come from blood? Their nights became endless. Every creak in the floorboards a reminder of that crack of bone, every flicker of shadow carrying the face of the man they had killed. Others found themselves fractured in different ways. Some who had admired the man at the altar clung to denial, insisting that he had been a holy man, a guide unfairly struck down. Their grief turned to anger, demanding punishment, demanding answers. They painted him as a martyr, ignoring the darker truths that had led to his fall. Families argued at their tables. Neighbors stopped speaking to one another, and friendships broke under the weight of divided loyalties. The chapel, once a place where everyone came together, had become the source of bitter division. The woman whose secrets had been exposed during the confrontation felt a strange kind of justice in his death, though it gave her no peace. She had long dreamed of him being silenced, but standing over his lifeless body had not erased her pain. If anything, it deepened it. His absence did not erase the shame he had planted in her, nor did it undo the scars of betrayal. She found herself both hating and mourning him, a contradiction that left her restless and hollow. For the wider community, the crime cracked open something larger than one man's death. It forced them to face truths they had buried just as deeply as the bones beneath the chapel. The stories of manipulation, of secrets whisked into weapons, of wealth used to buy devotion, all of it began to surface. Some people felt vindicated, finally free to speak the things they had kept quiet for years. Others recoiled, unable to reconcile the image of the man they had trusted with the sins revealed about him. His reputation, once untouchable, now swung wildly between saint and monster, depending on who spoke his name. The law soon became involved, though even that brought little clarity. Officials from outside the town came in, questioning, gathering testimonies, pressing for details. But the accounts they collected contradicted one another at every turn. Some swore the killing had been intentional, a calculated act of defiance. Others claimed it had been an accident, a struggle gone too far. And then some refused to speak at all, their silence either fear or loyalty, no one could tell which. The truth was slippery, impossible to hold in clean lines. For the one who had struck the blow, the legal consequences were as heavy as the moral ones. They faced trial, standing before strangers who knew nothing of the years that had led to that night. Every detail of their life was picked apart, their actions analyzed, their intentions debated. To the court, it became a question of crime and punishment stripped of the tangled history, the years of control, the buried secrets. To them, it was not about survival or resistance. It was about guilt. The town watched as someone they had known all their life was turned into a criminal in the eyes of the law. The verdict, when it came, split the community even further. Some saw it as justice, others as a cruel misunderstanding of what had truly happened. Families stopped attending the chapel altogether. Others continued, but the air inside was never the same. The altar remained stained, no matter how hard they scrubbed, and every prayer whispered there seemed to carry an echo of what had been done. The emotional toll was deepest among those closest to the crime. Friends of the man at the altar carried grief that was tangled with betrayal, mourning not only his death, but the loss of the image they had once believed in. The family he left behind carried the shame of his secrets and the burden of his downfall, their lives forever marked by his name. The one who killed him bore the endless weight of a choice they could never undo, a choice that had felt like survival in the moment, but now stretched into a lifetime of guilt. The children of the town, too, were not spared. They grew up hearing fragments of the story, seeing the way adults fell silent when the chapel was mentioned. Some avoided it altogether, refusing to step inside its doors. Others grew fascinated, daring one another to touch the stones of the altar as if it were cursed. The chapel, once a symbol of faith, became a warning to them, a reminder of how power can corrupt, how silence can kill, and how even holy ground can be soaked in blood. The media eventually caught wind of the story, turning the town into a spectacle. Outsiders arrived with cameras and notebooks, eager to capture this scandal of the century. They painted the chapel as cursed, the town as backward, the people as either gullible sheep or dangerous conspirators. The town bristled under the weight of their gaze, some leaning into the story, others retreating deeper into secrecy. What had once been their private tragedy became entertainment for strangers, twisting the wound deeper. In time, the chapel reopened, though its pews were never full again. Candles still burned, prayers were still whispered, but the weight of what had happened never left. The ground beneath, heavy with bones, carried one more body now, one more secret folded into its earth. Some said the air inside felt colder, that the chapel would never again be a place of peace. For those who lived through it, the crime became the dividing line in their lives. Everything before felt distant, almost unreal, and everything after was shaped by that night. Some carried denial, convincing themselves it had been beyond their control. Others carried guilt, unable to look at their own reflection without seeing blood on their hands. And some carried silence, burying their truths so deeply they almost believed they were forgotten. But the land never forgot. The chapel never forgot. And the town, no matter how it tried to move on, would always carry the shadow of what had been done there. The night when faith collapsed, when power was broken, and when the ground beneath them all swallowed yet another secret. The trial became the closing act of a story that had already scarred the town. When the courtroom filled for the first day of hearings, people came not only out of curiosity, but out of an aching need to understand. Some wanted answers, others wanted punishment, and a few, though they wouldn't admit it, just wanted spectacle. The weight of the crime hung over the proceedings like the damp air that seeped into the chapel walls. Every testimony brought whispers. Every piece of evidence pulled the community deeper into the chilling reality that one of their own had taken lives and then hidden them beneath the foundation of what was supposed to be a holy place. The verdict, when it came, carried the finality that many had been waiting for. A guilty conviction. Years, maybe a lifetime in prison. But even in that moment, the word justice felt like it echoed too thinly in the room. Families of the dead wept, their grief tangled with relief. Yet beneath the tears lay an emptiness that no sentence could ever fill. Burying a loved one once is unbearable, but realizing their body had been left nameless and hidden in the dirt beneath a chapel was cruelty beyond measure. No gavel strike could erase that truth. For those closest to the convicted, the outcome was its own kind of punishment. Friends who had once defended him fell silent. Family members carried a shame they hadn't earned, whispers trailing them whenever they walked into town. Children of his bloodline grew up with a name they could not escape, one stained with horror. The conviction might have closed the case, but it did not close the wound eye. Tea left in the hearts of those who bore it indirectly. The chapel itself became both a crime scene and a monument. Once a place where people had bowed their heads in prayer, it now carried an unshakable darkness. Parishioners left, attendance dwindled, and eventually the doors were locked for good. Some argued to tear it down, to rid the earth of the reminder, while others pushed to preserve it, saying that erasing it would mean forgetting what had happened. The building stood silent, decaying year by year, its stained glass cracked, and its pews gathering dust. It became the place teenagers dared each other to break into at night, a landmark whispered about, but never reclaimed for holiness. Media coverage spread the story far beyond the town's borders. Headlines screamed of the chapel mass grave, drawing people from across the country who came agog at the sight. Documentaries dissected the crime, journalists wrote features, and strangers formed opinions without ever knowing the real texture of the lives ruined. Some saw the case as evidence of corruption in small-town institutions, others as a commentary on blind faith and the dangers of trust. For the families who had lost someone, the attention was a double-edged sword, validation that their suffering mattered, but also the painful reopening of wounds each time the story resurfaced. In the years that followed, The story became less about the man who had committed the crime and more about what it revealed. It exposed how unchecked power, when paired with secrecy, could rot a community from the inside. It showed how wealth, reputation, and influence had kept suspicions at bay for far too long, silencing questions that might have saved lives. And it forced people to confront the uneasy truth that morality often bends under the weight of self-preservation. Those who had once trusted him, congregants, colleagues, even close friends, reflected bitterly on their silence. Some admitted they had noticed things that fell off, little cracks in the facade, but they convinced themselves it was not their place to question. That kind of regret is its own punishment. They lived with the knowledge that in their hesitation, in their unwillingness to disturb the peace of the community, they had allowed a predator to thrive. The broader world saw in the case a mirror of recurring human failures. The need for control, the blindness of institutions, the ease with which communities can be lulled into complacency by appearances. It became less about the crime itself and more about the larger questions it asked. How do we weigh faith against doubt? How do we hold people accountable when power shields them? And when justice finally comes, is it ever enough? Even decades later, the memory of the chapel lingered. Survivors and descendants carried it like an inherited scar. Town meetings referenced it whenever new scandals arose. The phrase, "We can't let another chapel happen," whispered in moments of tension. Teachers in local schools used it as a lesson about critical thinking, about courage, about not turning away when something feels wrong. What had been one man's hidden crime became, in its aftermath, a cautionary tale that stretched far beyond the graves beneath the floor. Boards, justice in the legal sense, had been served. But real justice, the kind that restores, that heals, remained elusive. Families rebuilt their lives, but never whole. The town carried on, but never free of shadow. And the chapel stood as a testament not only to tragedy, but to the fragility of trust, a reminder that beneath the surface of ordinary life, darkness can take root and grow unnoticed. In the end, the story was not simply about a crime. It was about human weakness, the choices made out of fear, pride, or the hunger for power. It was about morality, tested and often failing. It was about how people are capable of both devotion and destruction, sometimes in the same breath. The chapel on the mass grave became a symbol of those contradictions, a place meant for prayer that concealed horror, a community that believed it was safe until it was not. And though years passed, and the grass grew tall around its crumbling walls, the silence it left behind spoke louder than any sermon ever had.